very, very difficult thing.
Well, let me explain something that you may not understand about the value-added.
Washington Journal airs live every morning at 7 Eastern here on C-SPAN. The House is coming in now for votes. One vote on a post office from Florida.
Appropriate mitigation measures to promote river values.
For what purpose the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 570, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2842 to authorize all Bureau of Reclamation conduit facilities for hydropower development under federal reclamation law and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3637, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3637, a bill to designate the facility of the United States Postal Service located at 401 Old Dixie Highway in Jupiter, Florida, as a Roy Shallon Rood Post Office building.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
This is the only recorded vote today. It's on naming a post office in Florida. I want to let you know about some of our live coverage tonight. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is among the speakers before the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. We'll have live coverage at BayPAC at 9:30 Eastern on C-SPAN 2. Today, President Obama met with Prime Minister Netanyahu to discuss Iran. Here's how the Associated Press writes about it. Taking sharply different stands, President Obama urged pressure and diplomacy to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, while Prime Minister Netanyahu emphasized his nation's right to a preemptive attack. Again, our live coverage of the AIPAC conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu will be on C-SPAN 2 at 9:30 Eastern. Earlier today on the Senate floor, Senator John McCain urged the U.S. to launch airstrikes against Syrian President Bashar Assad's regime to force him out of power, which the Associated Press writes was not supported by the Obama administration or its European or Arab partners. Here's Mr. McCain's speech from today.
The crisis in Syria has reached a decisive moment. It's estimated that more than 7,500 lives have been lost. The United Nations has declared that Syrian security forces are guilty of crimes against humanity, including the indiscriminate shelling of civilians, the execution of defectors, and the widespread torture of prisoners. Bashar al-Assad is now doing to Homs what his father did to Hama. Aerial photographs procured by Human Rights Watch show a city that has been laid to waste by Assad's tanks and artillery. A British photographer who was wounded and evacuated from the city described it as a, quote, a medieval siege and slaughter. The kinds of mass atrocities that NATO intervened in Libya to prevent in Benghazi are now a reality in Homs. Indeed, Syria today is the scene of some of the worst state-sponsored violence since Milosevic's war crimes in the Balkans or Russia's annihilation of the Chechen city of Grozny. What is all the more astonishing is that Assad's killing spree has continued despite severe and escalating international pressure against him. His regime is almost completely isolated. It's been expelled from the Arab League, rebuked by the United Nations General Assembly, excoriated by the UN Human Rights Council, and abandoned by nearly every country that once maintained diplomatic relations with it. At the same time, Assad's regime is facing a punishing array of economic sanctions by the United States, the European Union, the Arab League, and others. Measures that have targeted the assets of Assad and his henchmen, cut off the central bank, and other financial institutions, grounded Syria's cargo flights, and restricted the regime's ability to sell oil. This has been an impressive international effort, and the administration deserves a lot of credit for helping to orchestrate it. The problem is the bloodletting continues. Despite years of diplomacy backed by sanctions, Assad and his top lieutenants show no signs of giving up and to take the path into foreign exile. To the contrary, they appear to be accelerating their fight to the finish, and they're doing so with the shameless support of foreign governments, especially in Russia, China, and Iran. A steady supply of weapons, ammunition, and other assistance is flowing to Assad from Moscow and Tehran. And as the Washington Post reported yesterday, Iranian military and intelligence operatives are likely active in Syria, helping to direct and sharpen the regime's brutality. The Security Council is totally shut down as an avenue for increased pressure, and the recently convened Friends of Syria contact group, while a good step in principle, produced mostly rhetoric but precious little action when it met last month in Tunisia. Unfortunately, with each passing day, the international response to Assad's atrocities is being overtaken by events on the ground in Syria. Some countries are finally beginning to acknowledge this reality, as well as its implications. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are calling for arming opposition forces in Syria. The newly elected Kuwaiti parliament has called on their government to do the same. Last week, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis, testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee that providing arms to opposition forces in Syria could help them shift the balance of power against Assad. Most importantly, Syrians themselves are increasingly calling for international military involvement. The opposition Syrian National Council recently announced that it is establishing a military bureau to channel weapons and other assistance to the Free Syrian Army and armed groups inside the country. Other members of the Council are demanding a more robust intervention. To be sure, there are legitimate questions about the efficacy of military operations in Syria, and equally legitimate concerns about their risks and uncertainties. It is understandable that the administration is reluctant to move beyond diplomacy and sanctions. Unfortunately, this policy is increasingly disconnected from the dire conditions on the ground in Syria, which has become a full-blown state of armed conflict. In the face of this new reality, the administration's approach to Syria is starting to look more like a hope than a strategy. So, too, does their continued insistence that Assad's fall is, quote, inevitable. Tell that to the people of Homs. Tell that to the people of Idlib or Hama or the other cities that Assad's forces are now moving against. Nothing in this world is predetermined, and claims about the inevitability of events can often be a convenient way to abdicate responsibility. But even if we do assume that Assad will ultimately fall, that may still take a really long time. In recent testimony of the Armed Services Committee, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, said that if the status quo persists, Assad could hang on for months, probably longer. And that was before Homs fell. So just to be clear, even under the best-case scenario for the current policy, the cost of success will likely be months of continued bloodshed and thousands of additional lives lost. Is this morally acceptable to us? I believe it should not be. In addition to the moral and humanitarian interests at stake in Syria, what is just as compelling, if not more so, are the strategic and geopolitical interests. Put simply, The United States has a clear national security interest in stopping the violence in Syria and forcing Assad to leave power. In this way, Syria is very different than Libya. The stakes are far higher, both for America and some of our closest allies. The regime in Syria serves as the main forward operating base of the Iranian regime in the heart of the Arab world. It has supported Palestinian terrorist groups and funneled arms of all kinds, including tens of thousands of rockets to Hezbollah in Lebanon. It remains a committed enemy of Israel. It has large stockpiles of chemical weapons and materials and has sought to develop a nuclear weapons capability. It was the primary gateway for the countless foreign fighters who infiltrated into Iraq and killed American troops. Assad and his lieutenants have the blood of hundreds of Americans on their hands. Many in Washington fear that what comes after Assad might be worse. How could it be any worse than this? The end of the Assad regime would sever Hezbollah's lifeline to Iran, eliminate a long-standing threat to Israel, bolster Lebanon's sovereignty and independence, and inflict a strategic defeat on the Iranian regime. It would be a geopolitical success of the first order. More than all of the compelling moral and humanitarian reasons, this is why Assad cannot be allowed to succeed and remain in power. We have a clear national security interest in his defeat, and that alone should incline us to tolerate a large degree of risk in order to see that this goal is achieved. Increasingly, the question for U.S. policy is not whether foreign forces will intervene militarily in Syria. We can be confident that Syria's neighbors will do so eventually if they have not already. Some kind of intervention will happen, with us or without us. So the real question for U.S. policy is whether we will participate in this next phase of the conflict in Syria and thereby increase our ability to shape an outcome that is beneficial to the Syrian people and to us. I believe we must. The President has characterized the prevention of mass atrocities as, quote, a core national security interest, unquote. He has made it the objective of the United States that the killing in Syria must stop, that Assad must go. He has committed the prestige and credibility of our nation to that goal, and it is the right goal. However, it is not clear that the present policy can succeed. If Assad manages to cling to power, or even if he manages to sustain his slaughter for months to come, with all the human and geopolitical costs that entails, it would be a strategic and moral defeat for the United States. We must not allow this to happen. For this reason, the time has come for a new policy. As we continue to isolate Assad diplomatically and economically, we should work with our closest friends and allies to support opposition groups inside Syria, both political and military, to help them organize themselves into a more cohesive and effective force that can put an end to the bloodshed and force Assad and his loyalists to leave power. Rather than closing off the prospects for some kind of negotiated transition that is acceptable to the Syrian opposition, foreign military intervention is now the necessary factor to reinforce this option. Assad needs to know that he will not win. What opposition groups in Syria need most urgently is relief from Assad's tank and artillery sieges in the many cities that are still contested. Homs is lost for now, but Idlib and Hama and Qusair and Deraa and other cities in Syria could still be saved. But time is running out. Assad's forces are on the march. Providing military assistance to the Free Syrian Army and other opposition groups is necessary, but at this late hour, that alone will not be sufficient to stop the slaughter and save innocent lives. The only realistic way to do so is with foreign air power. Therefore, at the request of the Syrian National Council, the Free Syrian Army, and local coordinating committees inside the country, the United States should lead an international effort to protect key population centers in Syria, especially in the north, through airstrikes on Assad's forces. To be clear, this will require the United States to suppress enemy air defenses in at least part of the country. The ultimate goal of airstrikes should be to establish and defend safe havens in Syria, especially in the north, in which opposition forces can organize and plan their political and military activities against Assad. These safe havens could serve as platforms for the delivery of humanitarian and military assistance, including weapons and ammunition, body armor, and other personal protective equipment, tactical intelligence, secure communications equipment, food and water, and medical supplies. These safe havens could also help the Free Syrian Army and other armed groups in Syria to train and organize themselves into more cohesive and effective military forces, likely with the assistance of foreign partners. The benefit for the United States in helping to lead this effort directly is that it would allow us to better empower those Syrian groups that share our interests, those groups that reject al-Qaeda and the Iranian regime, and commit to the goal of an inclusive, democratic transition as called for by the Syrian National Council. If we stand on the sidelines, others will pick winners, and this will not always be in our liking or in our interest. This does not mean the United States should go it alone. I repeat, this does not mean that the United States should go it alone. We should not. We should seek the active involvement of key Arab partners such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, and Qatar, and willing allies in the EU and NATO, the most important of which, in this case, is Turkey. There will be no UN Security Council mandate for such an operation. Russia and China took that option off the table long ago. But let's not forget, NATO took military action to save Kosovo in 1999 without formal UN authorization. There is no reason why the Arab League or NATO or a leading coalition within the Friends of Syria contact group, or all of them speaking in unison, could not provide a similar international mandate for military measures to save Syria today. Could such a mandate be gotten? I believe it could be. Foreign capitals across the world are looking to the United States to lead, especially now that the situation in Syria has become an armed conflict. But what they see is an administration still hedging its bets. On the one hand, insisting that Assad's fall is inevitable, but on the other, unwilling even to threaten more assertive actions that could make it so. The rhetoric out of NATO has been much more self-defeating. Far from making it clear to Assad that all options are on the table, key alliance leaders are going out of their way to publicly take options off the table. Last week, the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Rasmussen, said that the alliance has not even discussed the possibility of NATO action in Syria, saying, quote, "I don't envision such a role for the alliance." The following day, the Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral James Stavridis, testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee that NATO has done no contingency planning, none, for potential military operations in Syria. That's not how NATO approached Bosnia or Kosovo or Libya. Is it now the policy of NATO or the United States, for that matter, to tell the perpetrators of mass atrocities in Syria or elsewhere that they can go on killing innocent civilians by the hundreds of thousands, and the greatest alliance in history will not even bother to conduct any planning? about how we might stop them? Is that NATO's policy now? Is that our policy? Because that is the practical effect of this kind of rhetoric. It gives Assad and his foreign allies a green light for greater brutality. Not surprisingly, many countries, especially Syria's neighbors, are also hedging their bets on the outcome in Syria. They think Assad will go, but they're not yet prepared to put all their chips on that bet. Even less so now that Assad's forces have broken Homs and seem to be gaining momentum. There is only one nation that can alter this dynamic, and that is the United States of America. The President must state unequivocally that under no circumstances will Assad be allowed to finish what he has started, and there is no future in which Assad and his lieutenants will remain in control of Syria, and that the United States is prepared to use the full weight of our air power to make it so. It is only when we have clearly and completely committed ourselves that we can expect other nations to do the same. Only then would we see what is really possible in winning international support to stop the killing in Syria. Are there dangers and risks and uncertainties in this approach? Absolutely. There are no ideal options in Syria. All of them contain significant risk. Many
Only for you, Karen.
Ms. Bass of California. Ms. Bass of California votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Brady of Iowa. Mr. Braley of Iowa votes aye. Mr. Gingrey of Georgia. Mr. Gingrey of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Larson of Connecticut. Mr. Larson of Connecticut votes aye. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa votes aye.
On this vote, you just told Gingrey he was coming.
Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 361, the nays are 2. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Matheson votes aye.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 362, the nays are 2, two-thirds being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to consider is laid on the table. The gentleman from California rise.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's desk Senate Concurrent Resolution 35 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 35, concurrent resolution to establish the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies for the inauguration of the President-elect and Vice President-elect of the United States on January 21, 2013.
Is there objection to the consideration of the concurrent resolution? Without objection, the current resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's desk Senate Concurrent Resolution 36 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 36, concurrent resolution to authorize the use of the Rotunda and Emancipation Hall of the Capitol by the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies in connection with the proceedings and ceremonies conducted for the inauguration of the President-elect and the Vice President-elect of the United States.
Is there objection to the consideration of the concurrent resolution? Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose?
Chair is prepared to entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, last week border protectors were patrolling near Roma, Texas when they spotted drug smugglers trying to move narcotics into the United States. The agents found themselves under attack from the Mexican side when narco-terrorists unleashed gunfire from the other side of the Rio Grande River, and the agents returned fire in self-defense. This sounds like a scene out of a Western movie, but unfortunately this is real life on the Texas border. The legal ports of entry may seem safe, but in the hinterlands it's the Wild West. Law enforcement is outmanned, outgunned, and outfinanced. We have troops protecting the borders of other countries. Why don't they protect ours? But Texas is defending itself. It has to. On Thursday, Texas DPS unveiled the second in its fleet of 6 gunboats that will now patrol the Rio Grande. Why does Texas have to send its own Navy to defend the border of the United States? Because the federal government refuses to do its job, and someone has to protect the homeland the way it is.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise?
To address the House and...
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
The slaughter continues in Syria. Mr. Speaker, last week I visited the head of mission at the Syrian embassy and delivered letters that indicated that Mr. Assad, President Assad, must go, and that there must be an establishment of safe houses or safe places for women and children, and that at that time the bodies of those deceased journalists should come out, and as well that the Red Cross and International Red Cross should be allowed in. Then there was a protesting and suggesting it was the rebels that wasn't allowing the Red Cross in. But we now heard from a journalist that was able to get out that those journalists were actually murdered. And now today we're reading that the Syrian authorities Friday blocked an officially sanctioned Red Cross convoy laden with food and medical supplies from entering a devastated neighborhood and homes 1 day after the army overwhelmed the rebel stronghold here after months-long siege. No rebels, just Assyrian despots, the people who want to kill their own people, Mr. Assad needs to go. We need to get women and children safe. We need to be able to get justice for the dead journalists. And now the world needs to rise up, and I look forward to the Syrian resolution passing, but something must be done. Mr. Assad, you have to go. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to rise today to congratulate the Eden Prairie Boys Eagles swimming team and diving team on winning the Minnesota State Championship recently. The Eden Prairie Eagles earned more than 100 points over their two closest competitors that tied for second place. A key relay team of Aaron Greenberg, Maverick Covey, Mike Solfelt, and Bryce Boston also set a new state record in the 200-yard freestyle relay, and they also took home first place in the 400-yard style relay. Mr. Speaker, these student athletes have absolutely seen that teamwork builds character, confidence, and self-worth. It also teaches our young people the importance of working together to find common ground. Lessons such as playing competitively while also having respect for your opponent are lifelong and will make for absolutely strong, successful adults and future strong leaders. Mr. Speaker, congratulations to the Eden Prairie Boys Swimming and Diving Team.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today to urge this body, the United States Congress, to join my constituents' call and meet my constituents' call for comprehensive immigration reform. My constituents across the ideological spectrum, from those on the right who decry the rule of law, the undermining of the state of law and the affront to our sovereignty, to those on the left who decry the tearing apart of families and the injustices of the inhumane treatment of people in our immigration system, we are calling out to fix our broken immigration system and replace it with one who works. There are upwards of 10 to 15 million people residing in this country illegally. We owe it to the citizens of our country, conservative, liberal, and everywhere in between, to make sure that there are close to 0 people living in this country illegally, and pass comprehensive immigration reform as both President Bush and President Obama have called for on a bipartisan basis. My constituents demand action now. I call upon Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Request to address the House and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Daniel J. Mabin, World War II veteran, Korea War-era veteran, passed away this afternoon in Pennsylvania. Dan was a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and he was the loving husband of his wife, Sheila, and was preceded in death by his beloved son, Sean. Dan was a member of what has been called the greatest generation any society has ever produced, and he certainly earned that distinction by defending this country through 2 conflicts. Sheila was his English war bride, who he brought to America and settled in Levittown, Pennsylvania. When he left the service, Dan worked hard to support his growing family, often working several jobs. Dan was someone who loved his country and cared deeply about its future. During his life, he served his community and worked to better the lives of those around him. He imparted these values to his children, who have gone on to contribute greatly to their communities as well. I had the honor and the pleasure of knowing Dan. He's left a lasting impression on those he touched. May his soul rest in peace. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Nevada seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today in Nevada, a funeral service is being held for William J. Bill Raggio. When you think of Nevada public service, in the modern era, Bill Raggio's name tops all lists. When you think of legislative leadership in the Silver State, Bill Raggio's name tops all lists. When you think of self-made individuals in Nevada, Bill Raggio's name once again tops all lists. It is with sincere sorrow that I rise on the floor of the United States House of Representatives on this day to memorialize a native son of the state of Nevada, a husband, a dad, a community and statewide leader, a role model, and a friend with whom I had the honor and privilege of serving the people of Nevada with for many years. My condolences to Bill's daughters, Leslie and Tracy, and to his wife, Dale. God bless you, Bill.
I yield back, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman yields back. The chair For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
To address the House 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized. 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, America has no better friend on the face of the earth than the people of Israel. Israel is the only nation on earth that can say they've stood by America 100% of the time for 100% of their existence. And it's so important today that America, that our President, that this Congress stand behind the people of Israel at this moment of supreme peril. When the Iranians are building a nuclear weapon as fast as they can, that the Iranians have said they're going to use it, America must stand by Israel. There should be no doubt in the mind of every Israeli, of every friend of Israel around the world, that America will stand behind her best friend 100% of the time, just as they have stood beside us 100% of the time. We will be there for Israel to defend her safety, her security, and her prosperity against any enemy, anytime, anywhere.
Gentleman yields back. The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leaves of absence is requested for Mr. Bishop of New York for today, Mr. Danny Davis of Illinois for today and Thursday, March 8th, Ms. Moore of Wisconsin for today and March 6th, and Mr. Reyes of Texas for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege and honor to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives in this world's great deliberative body. And taking it from the top, as I listen to the statements that were made tonight in the 1 minute, I think of the gentlelady from Texas and her statement about Syria. Now, I'm not here, Mr. Speaker, to defend President Assad in Syria. In fact, I think he needs to go. And I believe that all people of the world have a right to a self-determination, and they should not live under tyranny, and they should not live under despotism. I just think back when some of us objected that the former Speaker of the House, Mr. Speaker, and that was Nancy Pelosi, as she took over the big gavel, she set up a diplomatic tour and mission, and one of those places was Syria. And I remember the President of the United States, whom according to the Constitution is in control of, and I'll say according to the interpretation of the Constitution, he's Commander-in-Chief, but also controls the foreign policy. It's implicit, and it's more than a two-century practice that you have to have the President of the United States as conducting foreign policy, and the President of the United States was George W. Bush, who asked the then Speaker of the House, please do not go to Syria. Do not seek to negotiate with President Assad. Do not upset the diplomacy that's taking place between the United States and Syria, or the lack of that diplomacy. And I think about that time when Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker, crossed that line, even though it was requested of the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces, and the individual who is in command of all of our foreign policy, had asked her not to go. Now we see what's going on in Syria, and I listen to the comments, and I just think that if the gentlelady from Texas had spoken up at that time when I did, it might be a little bit easier to hear tonight than this particularly was. But, Mr. Speaker, there's many things in front of us in this Congress, and among them, of course, are economics and national defense and our national security. Right now, as I listen to the gentleman from Texas talk about the Israelis, and there's an event going on tonight that brings together about 12,000 people that are some Israelis, many people of Jewish origin here in the United States, and all that will be sitting there at the AIPAC dinner will be strongly supporting an independent Israel that is in control of defending themselves, the sovereignty of Israel. And I'm a strong supporter of Israel. And I look at the country of Israel surrounded by their enemies, formed in 1948, and for most of my life I've watched Israel develop and defend herself, and I've watched how they are the most stable and reliable democracy in the Middle East, and for a long time they were the only democracy in the Middle East. They would be the only place for a long time where an Arab could get a fair trial out of all the Middle East. And today we're seeing the dialogue take place from Iran, not with Iran, And Israel is the stated target of Ahmadinejad. Now, they've been working in Iran, as you know, Mr. Speaker, urgently and feverishly to develop a nuclear weapon and a means to deliver it. When I came into this Congress and sworn in 2003, I sat down then with the ambassadors to the United States from Germany, France, and Great Britain, who were seeking to convince us here in the Congress that we should encourage our president to open up dialogue with the Iranians and perhaps be able to talk them out of their nuclear endeavor. Now, that was in September of 2003 that meeting took place over in the Rayburn Building, Mr. Speaker. And as I sat in on that meeting and weighed in on that meeting, I have kept hearing the message come back about open up dialogue. They wanted to open up dialogue. And so when it came around to the opportunity where I had the floor, I asked those three ambassadors from each United Kingdom, France, and Germany, what is your long-term agenda here? What do you propose to do? And they said, well, we want to open up dialogue. And my answer was, well, if we open up dialogue with Iran, what is the next step? They said, we're only here to talk about opening up dialogue. But if you open up dialogue with Iran, there are other steps along the way. If we just talk with them and they refuse then to shut down their nuclear development within Iran, what are you prepared to do? And I watch these diplomats start to get nervous when you when you talk to diplomats about action, they start to get nervous. So what are you prepared to do? What do you mean? We all, I think, knew what was coming. Well, are you prepared to go to the United Nations with us and ask for a resolution rejecting Iran's nuclear endeavor? Are you prepared to bring about sanctions? And if the sanctions don't work, are you prepared to bring about a blockade? And if the blockade doesn't work and there's a line in the sand that says if you violate the blockade and if you continue on your nuclear endeavor, are you prepared then, if they cross that line that we might draw in the sand, are you prepared then to go to the desert and enforce the very things that are being started in this dialogue here? And of course they weren't prepared to do that. They weren't even prepared to talk about that. But Mr. Speaker, when you start down the path of diplomacy and you think that the only tool you have is diplomacy, there's nobody out here operating as a sovereign nation in the world that's just kind of dumb or duped, that doesn't understand that there has to be a force, there has to be some kind of threat, there has to be a consequence, and or what? Or otherwise we would go to the Iranians with our hat in our hand and say, why don't you be some nice guys for a change and shut down your nuclear development, your nuclear endeavor? And what kind of luck will we have with that? If they believe, as they seem to, that they're called upon by the entity that they worship to annihilate Israel, the miniature Satan, and then turn around and annihilate the great Satan, the United States of America. That's their stated purpose, Mr. Speaker. And their stated purpose is target one, Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv because it's the city that was created after the origins of Israel, and is predominantly of Jewish population. So they would target Tel Aviv. Now, any nation that would take that position, and we would think that somehow we would say to them, even though your goals are to annihilate Israel and to annihilate the great Satan United States, would you just please be a nice guy and stop developing your nuclear weapons? I mean, how naive could we be to go to Ahmadinejad and make that kind of a request under the guise of dialogue and think somehow that that's going to get the job done? We should have known then, I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, I knew then, that dialogue was not going to solve the problem. You never win on dialogue alone. You always have to have a leverage point where they will look at that, they'll look you in the eye and decide they mean what they say. It isn't worth it any longer. The juice is not worth the squeeze. I'm going to back off and stop developing the nuclear. But of course that didn't happen. The three countries that were here asking us to engage in dialogue, good people and good friends, and very respectable ambassadors each. And I have personal admiration and respect for them. But when you start down the path of dialogue, you must also understand there has to be a consequence at the other end. That consequence in sequence was go to the United Nations for a resolution of rejection and disapproval, make it clear in the international world that the Iranians were violating the nuclear non-proliferation agreements that were established, make it clear that there would be sanctions, and if that's the case, then there would be then an embargo and there would be a blockade, and on the other side of that, that there would be action to take out their nuclear capability. Now, the President, our current President, has said that he takes nothing off the table. But when you say that you take nothing off the table, that doesn't mean that everything is on the table. It's a little bit of that language that we've learned we have to look at pretty carefully and understand that, oh, there's a loophole in that. If you didn't put it on the table in the first place and you take nothing off the table, he may have already in his own mind taken military action off the table, and we don't know. But, Mr. Speaker, I was watching the news on Friday morning, and on Fox and Friends, I heard Gretchen Carlson release the story that Israel and the United States, and that would be President Obama and President Netanyahu, had reached an agreement that Israel would not strike Iran's nuclear capability before the election. Now, I'm a little amazed that that isn't all over the newspapers and all over the floor of Congress, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little amazed that that story has not been picked up and pasted throughout the blogs and Americans up in arms, Israelis up in arms. I'm a little amazed that that's not going to be the central discussion taking place in the AIPAC dinner with 12,000 people there tonight. And I'm amazed that the President of the United States can give his address to AIPAC, as he did last night, to such a great applause and support as was reported in the news. Now, I'm amazed. I'm amazed because if the President of the United States, now first of all, was the Fox story true? My experience has been you don't see news come out of there that's unbased or unfounded. It's based on something. It's founded upon something. I haven't chased it down to look at the original sources that are there, but I know what I heard. And it disappeared from the media. But if the President of the United States is even thinking in terms that he would play nuclear showdown with Iran by calculating an election date as part of that equation, it is an appalling concept to think that it could even be reported in the news as fact that the President of the United States would conduct his negotiations and manipulate his foreign policy, especially when it comes down to an Armageddon type of a policy, based upon an election date for his reelection. I can understand the motive, Mr. Speaker, but to think in terms of if something bad happens between Israel and Iran that might risk the President's reelection, that at least it's reported in the news that he would have had the incentive to negotiate with Israel to say, do not mount a military strike to knock out Iran's nuclear capability before the election. I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe we have that much time. I think we count this time in weeks, perhaps 2 or 3 months, but I don't think we count this time until after the November election. And furthermore, when you get into the point where we have these kind of crises coming forward, and we have the President who's announced the Iraq war is going to be finished on such and such a date, the Afghanistan war is going to be finished in 2014, and by the way, time out, Iran, on your nuclear endeavor here until after my reelection, then it'll be a lot more a comfortable time to deal with this crisis. I take nothing off the table, but I don't remember the President saying he has put military strikes on the table. I just remember him saying, I take nothing off the table. So here's what needs to be done, and I don't know that the credibility exists at this point within the White House for this to be done, but a President who was a credible individual could look at the camera and look across the ocean into the eyes through video of Ahmadinejad and the mullahs and say, I have put an X on the calendar, and that marks the date beyond which you will not be allowed to continue your nuclear endeavor. I know that date, but you do not. I will work with you so that you can save face in Iran, Mr. Ahmadinejad, and the mullahs. I'll work with you to accelerate the demolition of your nuclear capability to the satisfaction of American inspectors, and we'll do all of that so you look as good as you can and save as much face as possible, but you will never know what that date is on the calendar unless you push it too far. And by the way, if you're one day from having it all demolished and you're not done, sorry. The date is the date. You'll not be able to develop your nuclear endeavor beyond that date on the calendar, which you don't know, and I do. That's how you negotiate with terrorists, with cold-eyed people that believe that the United States is a great Satan, that they're somehow called by the entity they worship to annihilate Israel, annihilate the United States, and to negotiate with them, to think that you can open up dialogue and go through all of the resolutions and sanctions and embargoes and not the blockade, and let some of the rest of the world violate those agreements, by the way, and profit from it. We saw it happen in Iraq. It didn't work. We're watching it happen in Iran. It's not working. And now we're dangerously walking very close to that line of Iran having the capability to having developed a nuclear weapon and a means to deliver it. And by the way, when I say means to deliver it, Mr. Speaker, it isn't just a nuclear-tipped missile that can strike Tel Aviv from Iran, that 750 or so miles from the sovereign territory of Iran to Tel Aviv itself. It is the ability to put that anywhere in a suitcase. It could be delivered aboard ship. It could be delivered aboard a little boat. It could come about any way over land. Once they have that capability and it's proliferated, Mr. Speaker, there is no stopping the proliferation. We must end their capability before they have that capability, not after. After it's too late, that nuclear horse is out of the barn as soon as they are able to produce that weapon. And when it is, they will terrorize the world. We don't know where it is. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge the support of the American people and the United States Congress for the autonomy, the sovereignty, and the self-protection of Israel. And should Israel decide that they need to take out Iran's nuclear capability tonight, tomorrow, any moment, I stand prepared to stand with Israel. And even though this administration might send the message that military support and global political support would no longer be forthcoming from this administration, Mr. Speaker, I believe we have a new administration around the corner. And if we can wait, if we can tell the Iranians, wait with your nuclear development, and if we can tell the Israelis, wait with a military strike to take out the nuclear capability that's growing now in Iran, if we can tell them that, Mr. Speaker, I can say that the American people look forward to an administration that will treat Israel right, an administration that will support and encourage that Israel defend herself, and a United States of America that will step up and protect and defend Israel, as we are pledged to do, both philosophically and spiritually, and by the obligation that we have from history. That is just what comes to mind, Mr. Speaker, as I listen to the speakers here tonight. Syria is a very dangerous place, and I am for a regime change, and I don't think that we should have negotiated with nor sent a delegation to President Assad, and he is slaughtering and murdering his own people. To that extent, I agree with the gentlelady from Texas. But I came here tonight, Mr. Speaker, to address a number of pieces of subject matter. And on this subject matter, I'm looking at it, tomorrow is Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday with 10 states having primary elections, and perhaps out of that comes a direction, the likelihood that there will be one presidential candidate that will emerge and become the likely nominee, the apparent nominee. Now, I think the odds are a little less than even that that can happen, but it's close. But what we have is a longer, drawn-out nomination process than was anticipated. And it started back in Iowa, well, more than a year ago. And as we worked with the presidential candidates through that time, and some of them were just putting their toe in the water, they were looking, and they came into Iowa and decided they really didn't want to do it, and they stepped back out again. Others hadn't quite emerged. Rick Perry came on a little bit later in August of last year and made a credible run For a while he was at the top of the polls. Piece after piece of this race we've watched as some candidates took a look, stepped out, other candidates stepped in and stepped out, and now we're at this point where there are 4 Republican candidates for president that are in the race, and we're watching as the polls are starting to separate. And I don't want to make this prediction, Mr. Speaker, but I say this. If I look across the platforms of the Republican likely nominees, potential nominees for the presidency, and I begin to ask, we don't have a Republican agenda that's a national agenda. We don't have a consensus on that national agenda. This Congress has been moving pieces of legislation, almost all of them tied to jobs, jobs, jobs. Seems to me I can think back about 4 years, and I can hear our current speaker ask the previous speaker, Madam Speaker, where are the jobs? Jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, I've heard jobs, jobs, jobs for a long time. It's nice that we're about jobs. I haven't heard a lot about profit, 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 which is required to pay for the payroll to create jobs, jobs, jobs. And this profit isn't something that comes from a government job. Mr. Speaker, that would be something I hope the President overheard. Profit is not something that comes from a government job. Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector. There are 2 sectors in the economy here, the public and the private. The public sector is the regulatory sector. Now, not exclusively. When the public sector provides law enforcement, for example, that gives us security so that the private sector can operate. You can open up your shop and do business. You can open up your factory and do business. And so you have to have some security. You have to be able to have a judicial branch of government, more limited than the one we have, I might say, Mr. Speaker, so that you can enforce the laws. You need some functions of government. You need people to build the roads, and you need people to sometimes reach out and do for the people that which they cannot do for themselves. Leave us otherwise alone, I would say, Mr. Speaker. But the drain on the private sector, the productive sector of the economy, comes from the public sector. The public sector generally consumes the energy and the resources and the product of the private sector. Private sector invests capital, produce goods and services that have a marketable value, both here and abroad, and the economy dynamically grows. The federal government reaches in and takes out 22, 23, 24% of the gross domestic product, most of which needs to be the private sector side, because they're the only ones generating wealth. They're the only ones taking capital and reinvesting capital. Historically, for the last 40 to 50 years, the federal government has consumed about 18% of GDP. Now that's grown up to that roughly in the neighborhood of 23% of our gross domestic product. But it saps the vitality of an economy to have a government that grows and consumes more. It saps the vitality to tax and spend it in the government entity side. The endeavor of the President's economic plan should be to roll people out of public employment and into the private sector, because the private sector is producing goods and services with a marketable value both here and abroad. So I don't see that coming out of this White House today. I pray it comes out of the White House in less than a year from now, when a new president, Mr. Speaker, is elected who understands the principles of free market economics. And I could go deeply into that, but I'm hopeful that I can express to you tonight the need for this Congress to move on a series of issues that are very important to the American people. And that is this, that it's unclear who the apparent nominee, and in the end the nominee for president is. So therefore we can't go to that individual and say, will you please write up for me the platform that you're going to run on when you run for president, when you're nominated as President of the United States. That's unclear. But to me what is clear is there are a series of issues that are universal across the contending presidential candidates. And these issues are the issues that we should move through this Congress, planks in the platform of the next President of the United States. We're in a perfect opportunity to do this. We're here with not a particularly intense legislative agenda. It's kind of hard to have a lot of things to do when you send them down there and stack them up like cordwood on the desk of Harry Reid. So let's send some things down there that the American people can see are the planks in the platform of the next president. We know what this president will do. He gave us Obamacare. He tried to give us cap and tax. He gave us Dodd-Frank. Those are the big egregious pieces. He gave us TARP. He gave us the economic stimulus plan. All of that out of President Obama. He blocked the Keystone XL pipeline because apparently he'd concluded that it wasn't a national security issue. You need a little more time to study. I'll come back to that in a little bit, Mr. Speaker. That's the agenda of the current President of the United States. The next President of the United States needs to have a clear platform to run for office on, and they have been articulating that, but the American people don't know what it is because they don't know who the apparent nominee will be. Well, I can help out with that, Mr. Speaker, because I've sorted through the platforms of each of the viable presidential candidates and come down with a list of those issues that would be universal across the campaigns of the likely or potential nominees of the Republican Party for President of the United States. And I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that the leadership in this Congress move the legislation that's universal to any of the potential nominees so that we can lay out that platform for the next president. The planks are there. If it's something that's popular with the American people and it's in the agenda of each of the presidential candidates, bring it to the floor of this Congress. Bring it through committee first. Let's go through regular order. Let's mark it up in committee, bring it to the floor, and let's have a debate and a vote on it and send it over to Harry Reid. See how well he does rejecting the agenda that the American people support. So let me start off the list, and this is off of a bit of a research list that I put together about 2 weeks ago. It comes this way. Every presidential candidate that is a viable candidate and with a reasonable potential to be nominated for President of the United States on a Republican ticket supports a fence. I've stood on this floor over and over again and said, go down to the southern border, those 2,000 miles, build a fence, a wall, and a fence. We can't just think that 4 strands of barbed wire is good enough, or that a vehicle barrier is good enough, or that a single fence where the other day they showed a video of the panels in the fence where they went in with a post jack, that's what I call it, and jacked the panel up, and the drug smugglers and the illegals poured underneath that, and then they dropped the panel back down again and walked away with their jack, kind of laughing, and whatever the south of the border version is for high fives was taking place. No, we need to build a fence, a wall, and a fence, Mr. Speaker, and I've stood over here on this floor and demonstrated how you do that. But we need to go, and we need to go down to the border and build first the barrier fence that defines our border. And that says, don't come across this. It's U.S. territory. You can only come here legally. Next, we need to come north of there, a reasonable span, 40 to 50 feet perhaps, and put in another fence. I would make that out of concrete, precast panels with a slip-form trenched foundation in it. And I would drop those panels in and affix that in such a way that it would be a strong barrier so that humanity is not pouring through across the border. Then I would come again further up, another 50 feet or so, and build another fence. That can be steel, that can be chain link, it needs to be tall, so that you end up with a fence, a wall, and a fence, 2 zones of no man's land, so that can be enforced. And yes, we need to use all of the virtual that we can, all of the cameras and the sensory devices that technology will provide, so that we know to deploy our Border Patrol to the place where there's been a breach or a violation in that fence and enforce that 100%. We can't just let people come into the United States, shrug our shoulders and say, well, we'll catch somebody later on or somebody tomorrow. We have to ensure that if you're going to sneak into America, we're going to catch you and we're going to enforce the law. And in the end, if you violate that law, we're going to need to punish you and put you back into the condition you were in before you broke the law. Now, I don't understand why that somehow seems to be cruel and unusual punishment to encounter someone who is unlawfully in the United States, who has violated our laws, and if they crept into the United States across the border and entered the United States illegally, that is a crime, Mr. Speaker. It's not a civil violation. It is a crime. And so that makes the people who sneak into the United States illegally, people who commit crimes, by definition, are criminals. And I suggest that we build a fence, a wall, and a fence. Some will say we can't build 2,000 miles. My answer is, have you ever seen the Great Wall of China? Great Wall of China is 5,500 miles long, and armies marched on top of that. And the first emperor of China, Qi Shi Huang, back in 245 BC, connected the existing sections of the Great Wall of China so there was one continuous 5,500-mile-long wall. They did that not with huge machines and excavators and cement plants. They did that with stoop labor, putting it together piece by piece by piece. If the Chinese could build a 5,500-mile-long Great Wall, and it's one of the wonders of the world, it would be a wonder to me why we have such difficulty building something that approaches 2,000 miles in length. A simple solution to a complex problem. Our little old construction company could get tooled up to build a mile a day. Now, you know, I'm not suggesting that our people go do that, but if our little company has that capability, think what the big companies have for a capability. And then, by the way, I'm not either suggesting that we build 2,000 miles of fence. I just say this, build it according to the Secure Fence Act. That's the law we passed. That's what Duncan Hunter was for. That's what I was for. But let's just build a fence, a wall, and a fence, and just build it till they stop going around the end. It doesn't have to be 2,000 miles long if they stop going around the end sooner than that. They leave tracks, by the way, so you go out there and you take a look. Well, okay, they went around the end of this fence. Well, let's add another 20 miles. And now see how that works. And we'll just keep building fence until they either quit crossing the line or we've got 2,000 miles of it. It is, and the math on that, Mr. Speaker, is not that hard to figure out, although the question doesn't get asked often enough. So we did the math on this a little while back, and I've got to adjust it by a mental calculation to get it into contemporary, and now it's probably even a year old. We're spending about $12 billion enforcing our southern border, $12 billion a year. Now, if I take $12 billion divided by 2,000, that's $6 million a mile. So if you're spending $6 million a mile to defend the border, and the Border Patrol comes before the Judiciary Committee, the Immigration Committee, under oath and testifies, we think we interdict about 25% of those who attempt to cross the border. And I go down to the border and I ask those enforcing it, so you're stopping about 1 in 4? And they laugh at me. Oh, no, we're not stopping 1 in 4. Maybe 10%, some say 2 to 3%, but the most consistent answer I get from the enforcers on the border is 10%. But I'm willing to go back to the 25% number and use that, even though I think it's probably high. And so I do the calculation and I think, let me see, if Janet Napolitano, Secretary of Homeland Security, came to me and said, Congressman, I want to hire you to guard the west mile from your house across rural Iowa, that mile of gravel road, for that mile. And for that mile, I'm going to pay you the same amount that we're paying to protect our southern border, $6 million a year. Oh, and by the way, if that's not enough incentive, it's a 10-year contract. So she would lay, in theory, under this formula, $60 million on my kitchen table, and my job is to guard that mile of road and see to it that no more than 75% of those that try get across. I'm going to snap that up, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you, I'm not going to go out there and hire myself a multitude of people that are boots on the ground. I'm going to hire some. But I'm going to be very well aware that you have a benefits package that goes along with it, health insurance, retirement benefits, and all of the pieces that have to do with supporting an officer, including a vehicle for him to drive, multiple vehicles in some cases. I'm going to recognize that, and I'm going to look at the capital investment for the long term, all the way through retirement, of hiring boots on the ground. And yes, we need them, and those that are there do a good job, and they want to do the job. But I'm going to look at it and think I can invest some of this $60 million in this contract a little more effectively. I think I'll just build a fence, a wall, and a fence. Then I'll have myself a few Border Patrol officers there to rotate the shifts and monitor the sensors and watch the cameras that are taking place, and maybe man a guard tower here and there. And we'd make sure that nobody got across that. No, not anyone would get across that. And by the way, as I brought up Israel a little bit earlier, they built a fence. And they designed that fence so that it would be as reliable and as tight as possible. And it has It has some wire there, and it's got towers, and they monitor it, and it's been 99-point-something% effective. So we can learn something from the Israelis. Why do they build fences if fences don't work? We look down at the Mexicans. They have barriers down there between Mexico and Guatemala. There's a fence that was being built between Saudi Arabia and Iraq so that they could interdict the refugees that they anticipated would be coming into Saudi Arabia to keep them out. There's a fence that's being built right now in that bankrupt country of Greece, between Greece and Turkey, to keep the illegals that are pouring into Greece from Turkey out of Greece. Even though the Greeks can't afford it, they're building the fence to keep the illegal Turks from pouring into Greece. Now, some will say there's something inherently immoral about a fence. A fence, a wall, and a fence, in my case, Mr. Speaker. And I would argue there's a difference between that. Those who say, haven't you ever heard of the Berlin Wall? Well, of course I've heard of the Berlin Wall. I've walked almost every foot of the Berlin Wall. I have a piece of the Berlin Wall in my office over in 1131 Longworth, and it's framed. It's framed with a wood frame, and it's got a red cloth behind it and a piece of the Berlin Wall about that big that was chopped out on September 12, 1990. And it represents the single most significant historical event in my lifetime, the end of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall itself, literally the Iron Curtain, crashing down. But the Berlin Wall was designed to do something entirely different than all of the fences that I've described, Mr. Speaker. And that is, it was designed to keep people in, not out. And that's the difference. A wall that's designed to keep people in because you don't want them to achieve and access freedom and liberty and our God-given liberty rights. That's what the Berlin Wall did. It trapped people, it fenced them in. The other fences that I've talked about are designed to keep people out who are trying to come into the United States and other places in violation of existing law. And others will say, and some are clergy, that will say, well, you were a stranger and you were an alien in a foreign land, and I took care of you. There are a lot of quotes in the Bible that remind people that we should reach out to the less fortunate among us. But I happen to have stood on the Mars Hill in Athens, where St. Paul gave his famous speech, his famous sermon in Acts 17, when he said, "And the Lord made all nations on earth, and he decided when and where each nation would be." That was St. Paul's statement on Mars Hill in his famous sermon in Acts 17. Each nation has its sovereignty. The Lord decided each nation on earth and when and where those nations would be. And we should not shrink from that responsibility, that sovereign responsibility, to protect our borders and to protect the rule of law. And the borders of the United States are what define the sovereignty of the United States. And if we should accept the idea that there aren't borders, that people have always migrated, and somehow it's immoral for us to define those borders or tell people you can't come across, then I would ask those who advocate a policy like that, and I believe that it is an illogical policy, but those who advocate for such a policy, I would say to them then, how many people do you believe should be allowed to live in the United States? What should the population of the United States of America be? 6 billion people on the planet. We're the third largest population country on the planet, 300+ million of us. How many should live here? If you would ask the rest of the world, would you like to live in the United States, and we'll buy you a plane ticket to go, and we'll give you an unlimited supply, well, just how about the current access of welfare benefits that are there? 72 different means-tested federal welfare programs. And, by the way, refundable tax credits for illegals working in America under an employer ID number, 42- number, instead of a Social Security number. I congratulate Congressman Sam Johnson of Texas for bringing his legislation that prohibits any tax credits from going to, any refunds from going to those who are filing their taxes without a Social Security number. But they could tap into all these benefits, 72 different means-tested welfare programs. and the refundable tax credits that are there, and we'd say to them, you can live by an implied guarantee in the United States of America at a middle income level, middle class, without working, and we're going to see to it that it's all available to you. Come to America, we'll give that to you. I would predict, Mr. Speaker, that more than half of the 6 billion people on the planet would opt to come to the United States. And so how many people do those who advocate for open borders, what do they think the population of the United States should be? Should it be 3 billion? Am I right on that? Should it be 2 billion? Should it be 4 billion? I'll suggest it would surpass 3 billion under that kind of an offer, except many of those on the tail end of that great transshipment of humanity would realize that our system here would collapse long before you could ever load 3 billion people into America, or 2 billion, or maybe even 1 billion. And so what is the number? What is it that those who advocate for open borders and suspending the rule of law, what is it that they believe should be the future population of the United States of America? How many would they let in? And I constantly hear the lamentation that it takes too long to come into the United States legally. It takes too long. Well, I suppose if we just opened it up and we accelerated the process, and everybody that was in line, if we let them in right away, inside of a year, maybe that's not too long. And I'm constantly hearing candidates, presidential candidates even, some in the past, not so much now, argue that we need to speed up our immigration process and that those who are here in the United States illegally need to get right with the law and that they need to go to the back of the line. So if they need to go to the back of the line, do they really understand that the lines don't start in the United States? The lines for legal immigration into the United States start in foreign countries, where people have an aspiration to come here, and they apply for a visa and eventually a green card to come here. And that line, those lines, when you add up all the lines of the various visas that are out there, H-1Bs, H-2Bs, the visa lottery program, the list goes on, you add up all of that, the lines to get into, waiting to come into the United States legally are 50 million long. 50 million. 50 million people are waiting in foreign countries to come to the United States legally, and I hear constantly, the wait's too long. We need to accelerate coming into the United States. So we bring 1.2 million people into this country legally, kind of on average each year. 1.2 million. We're the most generous country on earth by far, and some data shows that we bring more people legally into the United States than all other countries combined. I can't anchor that in a data point, so I want to write that, put that caveat in the record, Mr. Speaker. But it's in that category, someplace pretty close. 1.2 million legals coming into America, drawing from a pool of about 50 million that are waiting in line. And in all of that, we only have about 7 to 11% of those legal immigrants that we even score their ability to contribute to the United States. The rest of it is all about how they can benefit from the taxpayers and the workers here, how they can benefit. No nation other than the United States would allow for the, what shall I call it, the evolution of an immigration policy that just simply grants this to people because they want to be here and gives them the authority to accelerate the legal immigration of the family reunification plan so that beyond that first individual, they can start bringing in people outside that extended family tree. We sat down and did a spreadsheet calculation. We wondered how many people could one individual bring into the United States under family reunification. We built it on a spreadsheet. We got out to 357 individuals brought in by one single individual, and we ran out of room in the spreadsheet and realized you really can't calculate it. But you can calculate the visas, the means by which we are legalizing people in America. And so it depends on whether you look at one study or another. There are competing studies, and that is between 89 and 93% of the legal immigration into the United States is not based on merit whatsoever. There's no merit quality there whatsoever. And then the balance of that, between 7 and 11%, does come from some measures of merit, such as H-1Bs having a skill. But I'm suggesting this, Mr. Speaker, that we develop an immigration policy here in the United States Congress with the cooperation of our next president that's designed to enhance the economic, the social, and the cultural well-being of the United States of America. Any country worth its salt is going to have an immigration policy designed to benefit the country itself. You know, we're not in the business of trying to alleviate, well, we'd like to, but we cannot be in the business of trying to alleviate all world poverty, all world hunger, all world lack of liberty and freedom. It isn't just enough to bring people in here and let them understand and be inspired by American liberty, God-given American liberty. But we need to promote and inspire it in other countries in the world. Instead of going there to bow before foreign leaders and apologize for being Americans. I'm astonished, Mr. Speaker, that we had a Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who told the world that she wouldn't wear a lapel pin with an American flag in foreign countries because she was afraid it offended people. My attitude about that is, go find a country that's offended that's not accepting foreign aid. And what are they offended about? American liberty, the way we've led in the world? Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas has so well and famously said, with foreign aid that goes out to people who set themselves up as our enemies, that vote against us consistently in the United Nations, he says, you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll hate you for free. And so I want to configure an immigration policy that's designed to enhance the economic, social, and cultural well-being of the United States. We should be scoring the applicants for legal immigration into the United States. We should be scoring them by their ability to contribute to this society, this economy, this culture, this civilization. And some of the ways that we can do that, we can look to our English-speaking allies for some guidance. Canada, United Kingdom, Australia come to mind. Each of them either have a policy or have been developing a policy to set up a point system, a scoring system, so that they can evaluate the applicants for immigration into their countries. And here are some of the criteria. Education, job skills, earning capacity, age. You want young people to come in so they can pay taxes long enough that you can justify paying for their retirement, and English-speaking abilities, because the ability to speak and write and understand English is the strongest indicator we have of the ability to assimilate into the broader overall culture. So there is nothing discriminatory about this other than, if we're going to have a policy that's good for America, we have to do some discrimination in favor of those who can do the most to help our country. I'd like to bring in and continue to bring in bright, energetic people, especially young people. And if they're pre-educated by the taxpayers of a foreign country, that's fine. I'm happy with that. Come on in here and help America's economy grow and raise your families, but embrace our American traditions, our American culture, our American civilization. After all, that's why you came. And to the extent that you bring some of your culture along with you and there's certain traditions that you follow, that adds to the flavor. It adds to the zest of life here in America. But, Mr. Speaker, when they come in and reject American liberty, the American way of life, and they try to recreate in an enclave the life that they left, instead of embrace the life that's offered to them here in America, I would ask, why are you here? Why would you come to America if you're going to reject Americanism and seek to recreate the place you left? Why didn't you just stay there? And that's some of the foundation of the immigration concept that we have, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, you know, as I get to item number 2 on this long list of universal items that I think all presidential candidates would embrace and this Congress should pass, I would add that we've got E-Verify legislation before this Congress. And I am not satisfied that it is written in a way that will work the way it's intended. I'm very concerned, Mr. Speaker, about the preemption that's written into it that prohibits the political subdivisions from supporting and enforcing immigration laws that mirror those of the federal government. But aside from that, I've proposed an offer that actually solves this problem without having to go there and preempt the states, and the political subdivisions, and it's called the New IDEA Act. New IDEA, it stands for the new, and the acronym is the New Illegal Deduction Elimination Act. What it does, the Illegal Deduction Elimination Act clarifies that wages and benefits paid to illegals are not tax deductible. And we know that, but the practice is to write off wages and benefits paid to illegals because they know that nobody's going to come along and enforce. And this has been a practice since the Amnesty Act of 1986. But under the New IDEA Act, then, the IRS coming in to do a normal audit of an employer's company would run the Social Security number and other pertinent data through E-Verify. So let's just say I have 100 employees. The IRS would come in, the Internal Revenue Service would come in to do an audit of my company. They would look at my receipts, my expenditures. They would look for anomalies in that calculation that might indicate that there would be money that was scooped out that wasn't, you know, that the tax wasn't paid on, or tax avoidance. And in process of doing that, they would run those Social Security numbers of the employees through E-Verify, the internet-based system that can verify whether the data identifies someone whom can illegally work in the United States. And as they run those 100 Social Security numbers through E-Verify, then E-Verify would either come back and affirm that they could lawfully work in America, or if there's no answer, there's no response, then it's implied that they can't work legally in the United States. So therefore, the IRS could deny that business deduction of the wages and benefits paid to that illegal. And they would give a period of time for the employer and the employee to cure any data that's there, and give the employer safe harbor if he uses E-Verify, so that for another means of lack of verification, they can't come in and enforce against him for hiring illegals. Safe harbor for using E-Verify, not a mandate that they use E-Verify. The IRS would make the determination by using E-Verify, and the net result is this. If out of those 100 employees, let's just say I had 10 that were illegal, and the IRS would say, I'm sorry, but you paid $50,000 a year to each one of these employees, and that's no longer a business expense because they were unlawfully working in the United States, and you had the tool to verify. And so that $50,000 times 10 is $500,000. That $500,000 that you wrote off of the gross receipts number, just say I grossed $10 million, and that $500,000 would be one of my expenses that's there, they would deny the expense of $500,000, $50,000 paid to 10 illegals, and that $500,000 then goes out of my expense column on Schedule C, goes over into the gross receipts side, and shows up down on the bottom line as net income, taxable net income. And that means that your $10 an hour illegal, by the time you pay the interest, the penalty, and the tax liability, becomes about a $16 an hour illegal. So the employer can draw a choice. Does he really want to take a chance on being audited every year and seeing his expenses of his illegals move from $10 an hour up to $16 an hour? Or would he maybe go offer an American a job at $13 or $14 an hour? I think that's what happens, Mr. Speaker. And it provides an incentive so an employer doesn't have to switch it all overnight. They can calculate the risk, and they can clean up their workforce incrementally if that's what it takes. Furthermore, in my bill, the New IDEA Act, it requires that there be a cooperative team put together between the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and the Department of Homeland Security. So the right hand, the left hand, and the middle hand know what each other are doing. No match letters that used to come out, they stopped sending them out a while back because nobody was doing anything with them. They would just send them out and say, we did our job. These Social Security numbers didn't match that you're sending in. Letter would go out. Nobody shows up. That's the end of it. You've got Homeland Security that is operating at the direction of the White House that has decided they're going to provide administrative amnesty. 300,000 illegals in the United States already adjudicated for deportation, and the President and Janet Napolitano and Eric Holder set up a policy, primarily Janet Napolitano, set up a policy to take staff time and scour through the 300,000 already adjudicated for deportation illegals that are there and see if they can find a means and a way to justify allowing them to stay in the United States. Administrative amnesty. My bill, New Idea, puts the three of them together so the IRS sends the information to Homeland Security and to the Social Security Administration. No-match letters from Social Security Administration go to the IRS and to Homeland Security, and it says, put your heads together, figure out how to enforce America's immigration law. That's what we need to be doing, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, the President of the United States, who has disrespected the rule of law, has a couple of family members who have received some type of administrative amnesty, asylum. Auntie Ornyango, well, I hope I don't have to spell that, but in any case, she's been in the United States for a long time illegally, since the 90s. President Obama's aunt, living in public housing, reportedly, was finally adjudicated again for deportation, and the administration, the Obama administration, declared her to be at too much of a risk if now, after all these years since the 90s, if she were sent back to Kenya, because his aunt is now too high a profile public figure to be sent to Kenya. Someone might kidnap her and hold her for ransom, and so it's a great risk. Therefore, we should give her asylum in the United States, where surely no one would kidnap her living in public housing and hold her for a ransom here. They just would do it in Kenya. So, Homeland Security, I presume the State Department may have had a voice on this, granted, according to news reports, asylum for Barack Obama's aunt. Now, if you can give asylum, if you can get asylum for the President's aunt, and you think in terms of the rule of law is applied the same to everyone, then who would it not apply to? Well, the rule of law surely didn't apply to Barack Obama's drunken Uncle Omar, who had also been processed and adjudicated for deportation and also didn't honor the court order to be deported. So drunken Uncle Omar nearly ran into a police car, found himself afoul with the law with a blood alcohol content of nearly twice the legal limit. It was 1.4, nearly twice the legal limit. And drunken Uncle Omar disappeared from the scene, and I'm confident that he went the way of Barack Obama's aunt. An administrative amnesty manufactured by the administration, not deported, not shipped off back to Kenya. So if we won't deport the President's aunt, if we won't deport the President's uncle, no matter what his blood alcohol content, and we've got 300,000 that are in the United States illegally who have already been adjudicated for deportation, and even though we're shorthanded and we're having trouble processing all of this, and the President has said, well, at least Janet Napolitano has said, that we don't have the resources to enforce all the laws, why are we using our staff resources to go try to give people an exemption from the law that's already been enforced? That's administrative amnesty. And so they've been scouring the books to give people a pass on the rule of law. And I raised the issue and I asked dozens of people across the spectrum in my district and around the country, what's the most important component of immigration law? And Mr. Speaker, what I hear is the rule of law. The rule of law. Not the idea that some people are needy and it hurts our hearts to enforce the law. It does. And but in the end, if we don't respect the rule of law, if we don't refurbish the rule of law, we have then desecrated one of the essential pillars of American exceptionalism. We cannot be a great country if we don't have the rule of law. We must be a country, a sovereign nation. Sovereign nations must have borders. Borders must be defended. Those borders must be controlled in a way where we decide who comes in and decide when people go out if they don't decide on their own. And we must preserve and protect and refurbish and enhance the rule of law. That's what the New Idea Act does. It has the support of all presidential candidates, formally not attested to yet by Governor Romney, but I believe philosophically he would tell you that he sees the logic in it, and we passed this off of the floor of the House of Representatives. I believe that Governor Romney would be supportive of such an initiative. Then if you go on down the line of the planks in the platform that are universal among the presidential candidates, you would see the desire to repeal Dodd-Frank there universally among Republicans. Dodd-Frank that's set up such that the government would decide which lending institutions were too big to be allowed to fail. And then, once declared too big to fail, the three entities in the federal government would decide whether they were going bankrupt and if they went into receivership and who and what entity would receive them. It's a horrible scenario to think that the federal government will decide winners and losers by statute written by the very people that contributed so much to the financial problem that we had, Chris Dodd and Barney Frank. So I'm for a full 100% repeal of Dodd-Frank, and if it has a couple redeeming qualities, and I believe it does, let's reinstate them back into the law. Let's not make exceptions and leave pieces there. Dodd-Frank needs to be repealed. We need to pass the repeal of Dodd-Frank here on the floor of the House. Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota has been the lead on that. She drafted the legislation to repeal Dodd-Frank. She's been a strong and vocal advocate for repealing Dodd-Frank. So have all the other presidential candidates. And we should do this for the American people, for the next president, and we should do it to honor the effort of Michelle Bachmann, Mr. Speaker. Next piece is the official English. And almost every country in the world has an official language, at least one official language. It's been so recognized throughout the ages. The single most powerful unifying force known throughout all history and humanity is having a common language. If we can talk to each other, we have an instantaneous bond with each other. And so here in America, we're so fortunate that English is that language. And yet, there seems to be an open effort to try to encourage language enclaves in America where the second and even third generation of Americans don't learn English. They just live within the enclave. And they're trapped in that economic and that cultural cycle of the enclave, the silo of an ethnic minority, instead of assimilating into the broader society. We need to establish English as the official language of government, not to disparage another language, but to unify the American people and hold us together as a people and strengthen our unity. Government does not need to be spending that kind of money on language.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And then repeal Obamacare and a number of other things. I appreciate